Hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining One Neighborhood Builders for our monthly Fresh Fridays series. I'm Allie Steinberg from One Neighborhood Builders. If you'd like to turn on captions, you can do so on Zoom. Here are some instructions. You can first click captions on the bottom of your screen. If you don't see captions, click more or the three dots icon on the bottom of your screen and then select captions in the language that you want. Then choose your caption language, then click show captions. If you have any questions, you can message me or message my colleague, Grace. Grace is going to put the instructions in the chat. We launched this Fresh Friday series to create space for practitioners, community members, policymakers, and all other interested people to learn and share about community development, including efforts to build tenant power through tenant unions. So let's get to it. Before we get started, just a few quick notes on logistics for the day. First, please note that we will be recording the session as we intend to share it with interested individuals who are not able to join us this morning. Second, if you have any questions or comments while one of our panelists is speaking, please feel free to leave it in the chat and we will try to incorporate it into the session. Towards the end of the session, we will also have an open Q&A during which you'll have the floor to ask your own questions. Third, we want to remind you that if you hear a phrase or an acronym you aren't familiar with, we encourage you to ask about it in the chat. My colleague, Grace Evans-Pettineau, will be watching the chat and will jump in to explain as she's able. This is a space for learning, so we encourage you to use it as such. And fourth, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. So today we're going to hear from some incredible panelists who are working on commercial and residential tenant organizing in Rhode Island. So Mel Potter is a tenant leader with the Elmwood Tenants Union, the first non-public housing tenants union in Rhode Island. Emily Harrington is an organizing committee member of the Atlantic Mills Tenants Union, which is the first commercial tenants union in Rhode Island. And Shana Crandell is the executive director of Reclaim Rhode Island, an organization supporting local economic and social justice efforts, including housing justice. Reclaim has supported local tenants organizing against their landlords and advocated for just housing legislation. Thank you all so much for being here. So now let's hear from our panel. So Shana, to start us off, could you explain to everyone what a tenant union is and what tools tenant unions have to be effective?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So the simple definition that we use of a tenants union is just a group of tenants working together to get the landlord to stop doing what they don't want the landlord to do, like raise rent, and to start doing what they do want the landlord to do, like make repairs and keep up on maintenance. The tools that tenant unions have to get the landlord to change their behavior is that there's more of us than there are of them, right? So one tenant alone is replaceable, right? And is not able to force the landlord to stop raising rent, to do repairs, but all the tenants in a building actually pay the landlord's bills. So a complex with a strong organization of tenants is able to actually put economic pressure on the landlord to do what they need. And in terms of what tenant unions have been able to achieve, I'm going to use examples from our main mentor, which is the Connecticut Tenants Union. They have 17 chapters across Connecticut, and they've won 5 collectively bargained leases. So what this means is the tenants union sits at the negotiating table with the landlord as equals and negotiates a long-term lease. So they've won, for example, 3-year lease terms with limited rent increases, maintenance schedule, communication standards, where, prior to that, tenants had been on a month-to-month lease, facing massive rent increases. So those are the kind of wins that tenant unions have been able to achieve in Connecticut and that we hope to bring here to Rhode Island.
Awesome, so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shana. So now I'm going to transition to Mel. So Mel, you're one of the founders and tenants of the Elmwood Tenants Union. So can you talk to us a bit about what issues you were facing as a tenant and why you decided to form a tenants union and what the union's fighting for?
So the property that I moved into is 1890 Broad Street. It's kind of become notorious now for everything that's been going on. Um, the reason that I wanted to be a part of this is because asking the landlord for repairs alone wasn't doing anything. And there were so many safety concerns. There's so many issues going on in my apartment and my neighbors' apartments. And anytime we ask for any types of repairs, the landlord just ignores it and goes about his day. Calling code wasn't beneficial, and pretty much everybody was just at wit's end, but people are just too scared and afraid to speak. So by doing this, it's given everybody the tools to come together and not be as afraid to ask for the things that we need, like repairs. I have cracks in my walls, trenches appeared outside of my first floor apartment without any type of warning, or, you know, um, everything's just been a mess. So like there's been no types of communications in regards to anything that's been going on, and the property is just not safe. So it was just easier for all of us to come together as one, as instead, like as Shana said, that one voice, they don't care, but when you all come together, they can't deny the fact that there's a problem, or they will deny the fact that there's a problem, but it's a lot harder to do so.
Totally. Thank you so much for giving us some context into those issues and how the existing protections for renters weren't really getting the result that you needed. And so that was kind of spurring kind of more collective action. Um, so thank you. And so now I'm going to talk to Emily. So Emily, you've been involved in the Atlantic Mills Tenants Union, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the first commercial tenants union in Rhode Island. So Emily, for those who don't know on the call, can you explain what Atlantic Mills is, what's going on with Atlantic Mills, and what inspired the union to form?
Sure. So, thanks for having us. The Atlantic Mills is a former textile mill complex over on Manton Ave in Olneyville, Providence, which is a majority minority neighborhood, much like the city of Providence. Pretty low income neighborhood, and the mill itself is made up of is sort of a complex of like the two towers. I'm sure you've seen it if you've driven by Olneyville. There's sort of a flea market complex in the middle section, and then there's another couple of auxiliary buildings, Building 8 and Building 19. And since the 50s, the building has been owned by the Brines family. Initially, for most of that time, it was owned by Howard Brines, and he sort of stewarded the building purposely as an affordable space for artists, community organizations, small businesses, the flea market, of course. There's a church, there's the Olneyville Neighborhood Association, and it's remained affordable and with some autonomy so that this really beautiful community that sort of represents a microcosm of Providence has been able to thrive there, even as other mill buildings and affordable spaces throughout the city have been developed, thinking of Fort Thunder, Rising Sun Mills, places like this that our city has depended upon to sort of call itself a creative capital and to have these community organizations have sort of a low cost barrier to forming and operating. And Howard passed away a few years ago, so the building fell into ownership of his sister, who is in her 80s, wants to sell it. Totally. It's a lot to manage. The city was going to buy it. They were under contract for a few years, and then that fell through Our understanding is due to some delays in environmental um, assessments, given that it's an industrial site. And so Eleanor put it back on the private market, and now it is under contract with Eric Edelman and Bob Burrell. Eric Edelman is a developer in New York. Bob Burrell is a local real estate developer. And Eric Edelman recently purchased the Lauderdale building in downtown Providence, using and was granted some tax subsidies for that. And subsequently, the building has been emptied of its tenants. If you look at the rest of Eric's portfolio, he focuses on old industrial buildings and sort of turning them into luxury residential spaces. So naturally, this was alarming to the tenants of the mills. And so in October, there was a really big community meeting at the Onlyville Library that really indicated to everyone in the community, whether you're a tenant or not, that there was energy to try to stop that displacement from happening. So the tenants then started meeting on a regular basis, and it became clear that the tenants union was the best way to go. Again, to use the same tools that Mel is using over in Elmwood, and that Reclaim is using, was to sort of bring us all together across the diversity of practices, across the different types of leases that we have, and just make it clear that we would be standing together to fight that displacement.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thanks for that. Grounding us in that history, that context is so important and makes a lot of sense why everyone was concerned and wanted to come together. So now I want to turn to Shana. So Shana, what has Reclaim's role been in the tenant union space in Rhode Island, and why does Reclaim think tenant unions are important for advancing housing justice goals?
Sure. So Reclaim has 2 staff members, myself and Rep. Sheree Cruz, and most of our staff time is spent helping building leaders build their tenant unions. So it's really important and in fact necessary that a tenant union is led by its members, so by the tenants of the building. And so what we do as organizers, as staff organizers, is basically coach tenant leaders, right? So we're in turn coached by the Connecticut Tenants Union and SEIU 1199NE, right? So what we're doing is bringing tactics that have worked in the labor movement to win boss fights to tenants in Rhode Island to use those same tactics to force their landlord to negotiate fair and long-term leases with the union. So that's the role that we play, is basically coaches of tenant leaders who are leading their own unions. In terms of why we think this is so important is, there's 400,000 tenants in Rhode Island, and it's a site for mass working class organization that can be a real political force in the state, right? So right now, tenants are not organized as a class, and by building out a statewide union where tenants are winning building level fights, we're able to build up that organization across the state and eventually have substantial political power where we can win transformative change.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shana. And I love how it's like building on the shoulders of work that's already been done. This didn't come out of thin air. This was inspired by like labor work, as you said, and by work that's going on in Connecticut. Awesome. And so, Mel, so to ground us in kind of what does a tenant union actually do? Can you tell us what does the Elmwood Tenants Union do? What are some of its activities?
Currently, there hasn't been much going on due to the fact that most of the people who initially formed the union with us have been evicted one by one. I'm the last remaining person at the property that's still part of the union there. But we were knocking doors, just giving our neighbors some information in regards to what the union was, why we wanted to do it, and giving our neighbors the opportunity to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be a part of it or not. Because it's something that's new to people and something that most people don't understand, you know, we had to make sure that we had enough information to give our neighbors in regards to why we were doing it, and the benefits of sticking together. Most people don't understand that, it's a beneficial situation. Things can get difficult at times. Everything might not always go according to plan, but people need to realize that if you stick with it and stick through it, that you can definitely make a change. It's just things don't happen overnight. Everything on the property didn't happen overnight. It's just slowly gotten worse over the course of time. So it's going to take a little time to rectify the situation, but people always want everything to be an instant change, and they don't want to take the time to do the work that is involved with starting the union. They just want everything to happen where they don't have to really be involved, but be involved at the same time. So, we've tried to do things like even just fun stuff to get people involved. We've had a karaoke night in the past to get all the members together, just to, show them that it doesn't have to just be all work. It's a new way to network with your neighbors that you might not necessarily have the opportunity to have spoken with. Because I know for myself, until I knocked doors, I didn't know who half of my neighbors were. I had the few that I did speak with, and due to all the ongoing construction and whatnot on the property, that kind of drove a wedge between everybody because it wasn't as easy to communicate with one another. So it gave us the opportunity to kind of try and retie those lost bonds with people. Whether it worked or not, as with everything else, there's the pros and the cons, but it's just been something that's been a beneficial part of my life for the past year. That's really made it, as difficult as some days can be, it's made it more beneficial, because now I just use my platform in order to kind of drive home the fact that this is going to be the new way of life. Like, we need to take back our power and let people realize that by having these unions, it gives us all our voices back to be able to say, hey, this isn't cool. We don't want to do this anymore, and get everybody involved.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for talking about how you've organized your neighbors. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, like increasing not knowing our neighbors as well. And so, yeah, also just using that as a way to get to know people better, as well as fight for conditions changes. So Emily, we were just talking about residential tenant unions. Can you talk about how a commercial tenants union like AMTU differs from those residential tenant unions? How is it the same? Can you talk about how they look different in Rhode Island and in other places, I guess?
Sure. I think starting with how they're the same is that they're grounded in that same power that we gain from solidarity with each other, as workers, as residential tenants, as commercial tenants, and the recognition that we're not going to get the treatment we deserve unless we can put ourselves at an even playing field with the boss, the landlord, the investors, and that their position of power depends on keeping us away from that table, right? So they're going to fight as hard as they possibly can to not sit down with us. And so how we get them to do that is to work together and to leverage that power that we have collectively. I think one of the major differences with collective and, with commercial and residential tenants is that we do, in Rhode Island, as commercial tenants, have many fewer rights than residential tenants. That's not to say to Mel's point that the rights of residential tenants are necessarily respected or enforced in any meaningful way. But as far as protections from eviction, sort of the legal ways that there are to sort of stretch out a residential tenant's retaliation against residential tenant organizing, there are a few more tools, whereas commercial tenants really don't have a lot of those protections regarding like notice for evictions, or things like this. We have the building code, the building has to be safe, but it's not the same as the levels that residential units are held to. I think one of the challenges also is that you can sort of reliably contact people at their homes. They're there, if not in the morning, at night. The door knocking becomes a little bit simpler to track, and there's a level of familiarity, I think, and trust that, again, to Mel's point, like there is certainly an atomization throughout our society and the way we all work that landlords and bosses depend on to leverage that power. But you are at the end of the day all coming home to your apartments, whereas the commercial tenants also have really different schedules, it being sort of an artist studio as well as a place for business. People are there really at all hours, so it's challenging to get in front of everyone reliably. But I mean, the bottom line is we're fighting the same battles. And I think Atlantic Mills, we're sort of doing this fight because it represents like a domino effect. The developers have effectively pushed people to the margins of the city, to the margins of where there's affordable commercial space, and there's just not any left. Like if we want to stay in Providence and keep Providence a livable city where we know our neighbors and can have creative practices and small businesses without having a ton of capital to put up front, we have to fight. There's just nowhere else to move. And so it is just sort of a recognition, I think, across commercial and residential tenants that it's time to make a change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I love the grounding and how there's a lot of similarities and the differences in rights and protections. So kind of going to that, Shana, we heard from Mel about how calling code didn't work and how there's rental protections on the books. Can you talk about what you're seeing kind of across reclaims organizing, about why we need tenant unions? Because we have code enforcement, we have a bunch of renter protections. I know the State House has passed several renter protections, and there's several more proposed this session. Can you talk about why even with those on the books, we still need tenant unions?
Sure. So, to start with code enforcement, Mel already mentioned this, but, in her city of Cranston, we think that not a single fine has been issued to a landlord in at least a year, right? So even though there are standards to which residential units are supposed to be held, they're not enforced. And same with a lot of those renter protections beyond, just code enforcement, is even where we have some strong laws, they're not necessarily enforced. And so one way to think about why we need tenants unions is that, ultimately it's not going to be the agencies or the lawmakers that save us from, the predation of landlords. It's going to be us, right? We're going to have to step up and save ourselves. So that's the idea behind the tenants union. And then, why we need tenants unions is right now the situation for most Rhode Island renters is we're on month-to-month leases, right? After that first year of a lease, most of us transition to a month-to-month lease, which means in Rhode Island that a landlord can kick you out every 30 days, raise your rent every 60 days, right? Which is a state of constant uncertainty, right? Where by coming together and forming strong organizations that can actually exercise power over the landlords, we can win dignified conditions and stability in our homes. So that's at the heart of why we need tenants unions. And then the other thing I'll point to is, we're in an age of rising fascism, and we need to build an alternative for working people, a vision of solidarity and a better world, right? And people are at home, right? So this is a site where we can build that kind of alternative vision, and an alternative to the right-wing politics of despair and destruction. So those are kind of the two things I would point to like the necessity of tenants unions.
And thank you so much, Shana. So this is our last question. It's going to be for Mel and Emily. And then before opening it up, I've seen some questions came in before the session and then in the chat. So get your questions ready, either type them in the chat or just prep yourself to go off mute. So we'll ask this last question and then we'll go into Q&A. So Mel and then Emily, how can people get involved if they want to support your fight, and kind of what should people be looking out for is what's coming up? So Mel first and then Emily.
I mean, if people would want to get involved, all they need to do is reach out to either Reclaim or any of the leaders would be willing to give information in regards on how to get a union started in any building or property throughout, the state. We would love to be able to just get this to be statewide and, give the landlords a taste of their own medicine in all reality, because people work too hard these days to have to keep dealing with landlords that don't want to maintain their properties. It's not a situation that's fair to the renters throughout the state. So if anybody wants to be involved, like I said, they could easily reach out to me via social media. I have no problem with answering questions. If I can't answer something, I have no problem with forwarding them to like Shana or Cherie in order to get the answers that they need if I can't do it. But I think that, this is something that's going to be an extremely valuable tool to everybody at some point. So it's why not start getting the trend going now and making it something that is going to be something that changes the course of history and show everybody that, you can try to keep us quiet, but you can't. At the end of the day, these are our homes, so it's time to take our power back and get this going.
Thank you so much, Mel. And we'll share it. Mel, if you want to put in the chat if how people can contact you, if their social media profiles they should know, feel free to put those in the chat. Or if you think it's better to contact Shana directly, just let people know. And then Emily, how can people get involved in this fight if they want to stay engaged?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Melissa. I think we're on sort of the same page here. To get involved directly, you can follow We Are Atlantic Mills on Instagram. Again, I'll put my contact info and the union contact info in the chat. Anytime we have an event, the public is always welcome. Or if you want to just come see the mills, you can shoot me an email. But I think just to echo what Mel was saying, this is sort of, we're at a turning point where we really are being asked to think about what it will take to have livable cities going forward, where we know our neighbors, where we know the small businesses, where there's stuff to do just walking around, like it's a livable place to be, where everyone's not just stuck on their computers during the day and grab hubbing food and not interacting with each other. And I think that takes a big change for people to change their thinking around like what is just the way things work. We're in this situation where we just are sort of resigned to rising rents. And of course, the developer comes in and changes the mill because it needs repair. And who's going to do it but a private developer? And will they just deserve to make a profit? Like, there's nothing we can do about that. And that's not necessarily the case, right? Like, we're living in these cities in Providence and Cranston and throughout the country that are interesting and nice places to live because we're here, making them nice places to live. And so we deserve to be able to stay. And I think, and it's just easy to be like, well, they gave us the 30 days, so that's, they fulfilled their whatever as a landlord, and now we just have to figure it out. And it's a question of really thinking about, legally, the landlords, et cetera, have the power because they have the capital. Totally. But we have the power together. And I think it becomes a question of like what's right and wrong and how do we want our cities to look? Who do we want to be living in these cities? And it's, for my thinking and why I'm in this fight, I want to be able to have a little art studio with my friends and not have the art practice be like a giant profitable thing. I want my friend to have space to have a band. I want Ona to have space to have a really important community space, and then a space that they can do events, and not have to have it be all based on requisite capital. Yeah, so sorry, I kind of zoomed out, but the zoom back in is like we need to change our thinking a little bit to like where the power is and what we're willing to fight for. And I think the work that Reclaim and that Mel and that AM2 and that labor unions before us and continuously are doing is where that work is.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thinking about the mind shift is so important. And so now let's switch to the Q&A. So Kimberly from Dare asked before about other examples in other states. I know we touched on Connecticut Tenants Union. Are there any other examples of tenants unions y'all are drawing from in other states or places?
Yeah, tenant unions are having a real resurgence right now. Tenant unions are popping up all over the country. There's kind of like a new wave of them. It's not that they're brand new. There was a lot of tenant union activity in the 70s. It got crushed and it's back. So last year, a national union of unions was formed. It's called the Tenant Union Federation. And the Rhode Island Tenants Union, which includes Mel's, Elmwood Tenants Union, and Atlantic Mills Tenants Union as chapters, we recently got invited to be a local of that national union. So this is happening in LA, Louisville, Bozeman, Montana, all over the country. Tenant unions are forming and they're winning, right? So it's not just in Connecticut that they've won collectively bargained leases. That has happened also in LA and elsewhere. So this is a real moment of tenant power. And I think Emily also has an example of another commercial tenants union. So this is really something that is very active right now.
Awesome. Yeah, if anyone else has any other examples, feel free to come off mute. Also, people in the who are attending the session too, feel free to hop off mute or put in the chat if you have any other examples.
Yeah, I mean the example that I have, and again, it speaks to the differences between the commercial and the residential tenants unions. But in Berkeley and in just the Bay Area generally, of course, there have been all of these moves to sort of sweep people out of mills and industrial spaces there. So this fight is happening, and that's like a huge site of gentrification. I mean, if you visited San Francisco 20 years ago, it was a completely different city than it is now. Same with Oakland, the rest of the Bay Area, like really hard to live in. And so these fights are happening all over the country. And also due to sort of the diversity of the places that it's happening, we also get to use different tools, right? So I can put in the chat an example of a residential tenants union in the Bay Area that then joined with a community land trust. And so now, the land is protected and they're working with different organizations to sort of use all these different levers of power that we have. So it's really cool being part of a national movement.
That's really exciting. And Joe asked a question about what are some of the main tactics to win better leases. So Shana, you talked about that, about that, what tactics they have been used to win. If anyone has any examples, that'd be great.
Sure. So the ultimate weapon of a tenants union is a rent strike. So I talked at the beginning about how all the tenants in a building together pay the landlord's bills, right? So the ultimate weapon that a group of tenants have over the landlord is their rent money, right? It feels like we need the landlord, right? Because the landlord is a quote housing provider, but in fact the landlord needs us, right? Because we pay their bills. So the ultimate weapon is to be able to withhold the rent that they need to pay their mortgages, right? And it's this speculative game where investors are buying up properties and properties, right? And all of that depends on our rent. So the ultimate weapon is a rent strike. I will say that in Connecticut, they've won all these collectively bargained leases without ever having gone on rent strike, right? So you don't have to use the ultimate weapon in order to get the landlord to negotiate with you. Other tactics that you can use are public pressure, right? So AMTU has done a lot of that. Mel, last year we did a picket outside your landlord's ice cream shop, right? So boycotts, public pressure, bringing in elected officials, and being able to leverage public funds that the landlord might rely on. These are all ways that a tenants union can pressure a landlord short of going on rent strike.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So Jacques asked a question in the chat. So going forward, what role could the unions play individually and collectively, including across cities and states, to challenge the looming cuts in Section 8 vouchers and other federal housing programs? All right, so zooming out a little bit, anyone have any thoughts, including people who are not on the panel but are here too?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think, unfortunately, speaking to Shana's point earlier, it's hard to know what the federal government is going to do or how to control them. So I think the real power we have is locally. I know to plug another little thing on the labor side of things, SEIU 1199, the healthcare employees union, is having a rally on May 3rd to oppose Governor McKee's cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, with the understanding that we can't depend on federal funding for that anymore. So if we cut it locally in the state budget, there goes our healthcare right there, and that hamstrings our fight for better working conditions for healthcare employees. So I think the same is true with federal versus local housing budgets, is that we really need to be putting the focus and the pressure on our local elected officials to preserve whatever safety nets we have here. And that can sort of buttress A, against the federal cuts, and B, give us some time and a little bit of security too, to then work on building this collective power nationally of all these different tenants unions. So then we have some power to leverage on the federal government for those cuts.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that's a big question. It's a great question. So yeah, anyone else have any thoughts before we move on to the next question?
I'll quickly just shout out another example of a local initiative that doesn't depend on federal funding. And I see Rep. Speakman in the room. the public developer, right, of social housing. This has been a big priority of Reclaim, right, where we don't need to depend on HUD funds to build like affordable housing, mixed income, a new generation of public housing. That's something that we can do locally and that our elected officials are pioneering here, right? So that's an example of a local thing we can do without having to depend on a federal government that's in chaos.
Yeah, appreciate you raising that example up. And then Celine asked, how are y'all thinking about being in lineage of previous gentrification in Providence, such as colored communities being pushed out of College Hill by Brown University? Anyone feel free to jump in.
Emily, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think that's front of mind in this fight for Atlantic Mills. We're, again, thinking of that domino effect. If Eric Edelman turns Atlantic Mills into luxury condos, fences are going up, fancy coffee shops all over Olneyville, you know, it's not just that people will be losing their space, their artist studios or small business spaces, it's that neighborhood then becomes a prime subject of speculative real estate investment that necessarily does not include the people who currently live in Olneyville. So it's really a fight for the neighborhood, and then again for the city, is that this, and the mayor has said it himself, the developers have said it themselves, like they want people, they know that these spaces are not affordable for working people in Providence. So they want people to come from Boston or New York to fill these spaces, and don't say where the people currently living in these neighborhoods are supposed to go. They're just saying away. And so again, coming together to say that's not how we're going to do this. We have a right to be here. We are the people who make this neighborhood what it is, and you're going to have to go through us in the form of a commercial tenants union or a residential tenants union. That there is just a sense of right and wrong here that we shall not be moved.
Mel and Shana, any other thoughts before we wrap up?
Everybody deserves a safe home. Everybody deserves to stay in the communities they've grown up in. No one should have to be displaced just because of the greed of the corporations that are coming in and trying to take over the cities and towns that we call home. These are our cities, these are our towns, and they should remain that way. And everybody should be allowed to do the things that they've been participating in their whole lives. It shouldn't have to change because of greed. I think that's where people forget that, you know, these towns and cities are made because of the things that we've instilled, the values that we grew up with. And we're the ones that have made everything the way it is for a reason. You know, I've lived in my neighborhood since I was 16 years old. You know, I shouldn't have to move because my landlord is greedy and ignorant to the fact that, you know, this is home. At the end of the day, it's about home. And without a home, what are we fighting for?
Yeah. And you know, the landlords and the developers are not going to kind of just recognize our humanity out of the goodness of their hearts, right? They're not going to say, oh, the beautiful artists of Olneyville, the longtime residents of Cranston, now we're just going to be benevolent. It's going to take all of us coming together and building some real power, right? It's going to take force to stop that gentrification. And that's exactly what we're doing in the Rhode Island Tenants Union.
Awesome. Great questions from everyone this morning and also great responses. I know I'm feeling a little bit hopeful as obviously the things are shifting constantly. And so it's exciting to hear what we can do locally and what's going on, not just in our communities, but across the country. So as we're here at 9:30, I wanted to thank our panelists for your time, insight, and expertise this morning. Also want to thank all of you who took time out of your Friday morning to join us. We hope you'll consider joining us at a future Fresh Friday. In lieu of our typical Fresh Friday, we are going to have on May 15th, 5 to 8 p.m. At Farm Fresh on Sims Avenue in Providence. We invite you to join us in person for a special Central Providence Opportunities Health Equity Zone collaborative meeting where we'll be discussing the future of Central Providence, including debuting the re-released Central Providence Roadmap. So that'll be in person on May 15th. We'll send out some information about that. We're calling it a Fresher Thursday, if you will. So please note as you exit the Zoom meeting this morning, a brief survey regarding today's event will pop up in your browser on your device. It'll ask you for some feedback about Fresh Fridays, and please take a minute or two to respond. It'll help us continue to improve this experience and hopefully provide a more engaging and helpful experience in the future. So thank you all. Hope you have a great Friday.